Well, hello there, AP Gov. Here's another lesson for you on the Supreme Court. Today's lesson is going to be about another process. So, if you remember back in the legislative branch, we talked about the process of how a bill becomes a law. It's a multi-step process. During the executive branch, we talked about the process of how to run for president. That was also a multi-step process. So today we're going to take a look at the process of how the Supreme Court takes a case. Now for this lesson, I'm going to have you watch a couple of videos which is going to highlight what those steps are so that when we go over this, hopefully some things will stick out. The other thing I'm going to need you to do is take a look at your vocabulary words, and you're going to have to sort of highlight the ones that we discussed during this, because vocabulary for this process is going to be really key. So let's take a look at how the Supreme Court works and how it takes cases. By federal law, the Supreme Court begins on the first Monday in October and usually goes till about the end of June or early July. Now, this session might be a little bit different because of the coronavirus, but normally what they do is they start in October. They go 2 weeks of hearing cases, then 2 weeks of taking a break where they can start writing opinions and listening to the appeals from other cases. And so it goes 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, all the way until June. And really by late May, they're not hearing any more cases. They're just trying to write the final decisions for the cases that they've heard. Currently, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. That includes a Chief Justice and then 8 Associate Justices. Only Congress can change that number. It has been different over the years, but it has been at 9 for quite some time. All right, here's just a quick review of how we how cases get selected by the Supreme Court. I'm actually going to use mine right here. So really, the first thing that happens is obviously cases can come from either the federal courts or the state courts. And we talked about in a previous lesson how there are 2 different court systems. So if you want your case to go to the Supreme Court, you have a better chance if your case starts in the federal court system versus the state court system. Approximately every year, there's about 8,000 requests. Now, obviously, they don't come all at the same time. It comes throughout the course of the calendar year. And just as a quick foreshadow, 98% of cases get denied. So we're talking about, and I know that the videos talked about this, we're talking about a very select few of cases that actually get selected by the Supreme Court. So out of those 8,000, what happens is that they pool those requests among the justices, and usually they have their clerks or their assistants look over those requests, and then the justices will decide whether or not to put that request on what is called the discuss list. And that's one of our first vocabulary terms. The discuss list is just the list where they decide to take that case that they reviewed to the other justices for a decision about whether to take the case or not. And so this is another filter right here. Once they put that case on the discuss list, then they will discuss that at a conference where all of the justices are there. And then in order to decide to take a case or not, it is called the Rule of 4. The Rule of 4 means that it only takes 4 out of 9 justices in order to take a case. And so it's the only branch of government that somewhat works on a minority rule, but that's only to take a case. And if they take the case, then they will issue what is called a writ of certiorari, or just a writ of cert. And that basically says we are taking the case. And again, out of those 8,000 requests, the Supreme Court takes about 100 per year. and that has gone down over time. Supreme Courts used to be more productive, but for some reason they are just taking less cases. Once they decide to take the case, then each side will submit a brief. So let's say, for instance, I am suing Parkway in order to wear my really big religious necklace while I'm teaching. And so my case would be Chazen v. Parkway. And so my lawyers would write a brief or a legal essay that basically explains why I believe I should win. And Parkway's lawyers would also do the same thing, where they would write an essay basically explaining why they should win. Both of us have to use something called precedents. We have to use past Supreme Court cases to prove why we should win. The law in America is very determined by precedents. They don't like laws to change quickly over time. And so once a law is made, or once a decision is made, that decision usually sticks around for a while. So if you think about Plessy versus Ferguson, which legalizes segregation, and then you think about Brown versus Board of Education, which strikes it down, that's 50 years in between those two cases. So once the Supreme Court makes a precedent, they don't like to change it. Another way of saying it, the more legal way of saying it, is stare decisis, which is how you pronounce that word. Stare decisis just means that we use past cases to make current decisions. And if a case is novel, like they've never dealt with it before, then you try to find cases that are similar. So for instance, when you talked about gay marriage, since gay marriage had not ever really been decided by the Supreme Court, they had to use cases from interracial marriage and from other discrimination cases. Another thing that you need to know is that not only would Chazen and Parkway submit their legal briefs, but interest groups can do so as well. Interest groups that have an interest in that case. And they would submit something called an amicus brief. Amicus briefs are written by interest groups to try to show the Supreme Court, hey, this is what we feel should be the decision and why. And so it gives the Supreme Court input from interest groups and outside groups that don't have a 100% interest in the issue, but definitely could be affected by it, and it lets the Supreme Court kind of know, hey, your decision could do X, Y, or Z. Once those briefs have been submitted, then we actually have the oral argument. We have the argument at the Supreme Court. Do not think of Supreme Court cases like Judge Judy cases. Basically what happens is your lawyer gets up in front of the Supreme Court and starts reading a speech about why you should win. Basically they're going to just basically use the brief that they wrote to make their points in oral arguments. And at that time that they start making their speech, justices can interrupt them with questions. And so it really becomes like a legal debate. So each case gets about an hour, and so each side would get about 30 minutes. The bigger cases, that can be doubled to 2 hours so that each side would have an hour. But they try to stick with that 1 hour rule. Once oral arguments are made, and by the way, at oral arguments, you pretty much know how you're going to rule as a justice because you've read the briefs. And so what people will do at oral arguments is kind of see who is asking questions and what side do they seem to be on. And usually you can get a good feel for how justices are going to vote based on what questions they ask and which side they ask them to. After the oral arguments, the Supreme Court will meet later in the week to discuss the case and basically take a preliminary vote. And at that point, this is where seniority comes into play. Whichever side the Chief Justice is on. So let's say, for instance, in the Parkway versus Chazen, let's say that Chazen gets 7 votes and Parkway gets 2. And let's say the Chief Justice is on the Chazen side of 7. the Chief Justice gets to select who will write the opinion for his or her side. And if it's a really big case, then the Chief Justice is going to select himself or herself to make that opinion. If it's a lesser case, then they'll probably assign it to somebody else. And so the Chief Justice always gets to decide who gives the opinion for his or her side, and then the most senior person on the other side. So whoever the most senior is of the Parkway side that only had two, they would decide. That senior person would decide who writes it. And then what happens is whoever gets assigned that opinion will write a first draft and then send it to all of the people on their side. And then it just really becomes like a English paper where you write and revise based on the suggestions that the other people give you. And you're constantly writing and revising until all of the people on your side sign off on the opinion. And that is why it can take months. So from the time that your oral argument is done, by the time that they announce their opinion, it can be 2, 3, maybe even 4 months in that time period between these two boxes, because they're constantly writing and revising. And by the way, they're also writing and revising for other cases as well. Once they come up with a decision, there is always the majority opinion, which is the one that gets 5 out of the 9 justices. That opinion is the one that sets the precedent for that case. We also, in our legal system, want to hear from the losing side and what their thoughts were, and so that opinion becomes the dissenting opinion. So you have the majority opinion and you have the dissenting opinion. Now, for each of one of those sides, you might have somebody else who agrees with the final decision, but came to that decision in a different way. And so they would want to explain how they came to their decision and how they were different. That is called a concurring opinion. You count them as part of the majority as far as their final outcome, but they don't sign off on the actual majority opinion. And you can have majority concurring opinions or dissenting concurring opinions. But it's the one, the majority opinion is the one that gets the most people to sign off on it. And that, folks, is how the Supreme Court takes a case. From step 1, like the case is heard for the first time in federal courts to state courts, to the time that the Supreme Court announces its opinion, this entire process can take somewhere between 2 to 4 years. And so that is that's why courts are not seen as the quickest way to solve political problems, but it is a way to have a political problem solved if you can wait 2, 3, 4 years. So that's a little bit about this. You'll notice vocabulary like discuss list, rule of 4, writ of certiorari, precedent, stare decisis, briefs, amicus briefs, oral arguments, majority opinions, dissenting opinions, concurring opinions. You need to know all of that and how it fits into this big process. I went kind of fast, but hopefully, having watched the videos, you have a pretty good understanding. By all means, if you have some questions, shoot those to me in an email or give those to me when you meet with me on the video conference later today or tomorrow at 1 p.m. Thanks for listening, and I believe that is it. Here we go. This is what the conference room looks like in the Supreme Court when they take a look at. This is where they either discuss whether they take the case or not, or once they've heard the case, this is where they just discuss it after they've heard it. This is what the Supreme Court actually looks like if you go into the Supreme Court. And here is a clip that you can watch when I post this PowerPoint on Google Classroom. This is from a movie called The People versus Larry Flynt, and it's a really good court scene that gives you an idea of what it was like to be in the Supreme Court. Here's just another chart that gives you the different kinds of opinions, and then which interest groups have been most productive in making briefs. And then here are some practice questions for you. And this is our next topic. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk